I don't like butt wink. I don't like butt cheek. I think they sound bizarre.
So folks should not be doing butt cheek activation to help with their... Welcome back to Past Your Prime, the podcast for active adults balancing life, training, and rehab. I'm Alex Keicher, pro volleyball player, dad, and a guy who currently requires about a half a can of WD-40 just to get my lower back moving in the morning. Today, we are tackling a massive roadblock that ruins leg day for thousands of athletes, that deep, annoying pinch or tightness in the front of your hip right when you hit the bottom of a squat. Most people hit this point, assume their hip flexors are tight, and aggressively stretch them. But if stretching your hip flexors actually worked, you wouldn't have to keep doing it every single week. The truth is that tightness you feel usually isn't a short muscle at all. It's your hip joint running out of room or your nervous system locking down the joint because it doesn't feel stable. As always, I'm joined by Craig Smith, physical therapist and strength coach. Today we're breaking down the real mechanics behind front hip pain during the squat, why your couch stretch might be making it worse, and how to actually open up your hips so you can hip depth pain-free. How was that?
That was a great job.
All right. Thank you.
Great job. Yeah, we see this a lot. People come in and they will feel tightness in the front of their hip, and they'll typically think that they have a muscle that's too short.
I was having this a while back, and I've mostly just forgotten about it. I don't think I did anything.
Is it still
specifically to fix it?
Is it still there and you've forgotten about it, or is it gone?
I think it's gone.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, because I did squats twice this week, some kind of heavy-ish slow squats just to try and work on some knee stuff, and I didn't think about my hips once. Maybe I was just thinking about my knees, but we're here to talk about the hips today, so.
So wild. Yeah. So yeah, you have had this.
I have definitely had this. I think a lot of people that have progressed their squat through progressive overloading have probably dealt with some sort of hip flexor pain.
Yeah.
I know that I had the TFL thing. Is that a hip flexor?
It's by far the most common one.
Okay.
And we can go through all the hip flexors, and I think it is important on this one to know some specific muscles, because I do think that they're common pain generators. But this one is such an interesting, because I feel that it's another of the group of injuries or problems that people will feel tightness, and because it's tight, you'll be sold that you need to stretch it. But I think the funniest part about this one feeling tight is that you're reducing the range of motion when people feel the symptoms.
What do you mean by that?
Your hip is flexing, so you're shortening the muscles, and people feel tightness in the muscle that's being shortened.
Okay.
So the whole idea that, I don't have enough motion in my hip flexors, let me go do an aggressive stretch to it, there's no biomechanical way that makes sense.
You love refuting stretching in every way possible.
Well, I mean, just think about that, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so if I'm flexing my hip, and my hip flexors are now shorter, and they really shouldn't be working at that point, but you feel it there, how is stretching the answer?
Well, for a lot of people, that's the first thing that they go to.
Yeah.
Tell us why we shouldn't do that.
Well, because it's not actually, that's not the reason.
Dumb.
Yeah, because it's dumb. Because it's not the reason you feel anything there. So the whole idea that you're going to stretch it, it may feel better in the moment. Once again, you'll take advantage of a spinal reflex that shuts the muscle down if it's overactive, but I don't think it's a very useful thought process.
I don't know why that just reminded me of the side-lying foam roller. I want to call it a hip stretch that you had me do
For hip hinge rotation.
But
that's a very different thought process.
Okay.
Right? So because I think the important thing, the hip is really interesting. And so this one, I think you have to realize that the hip is not perfectly in one plane of motion. It's actually in a combined plane. So when you are flexing somebody's hip in the sagittal plane, you're also producing hip internal rotation. So when somebody goes in for a squat and you start to go down, you're not just eating up hip flexion range of motion, you're eating up hip internal rotation range of motion. That's why people will feel more comfortable typically with like an outfoot if they have any internal rotation limitation, because they actually run out of hip internal rotation before anything else. And then once that happens, that causes the pelvis to posteriorly tilt, which is what you'll hear people call it a whole bunch of different things. I actually hate the term butt wink. Have you heard of that before?
Yeah.
It's like one of those things like just sounds disgusting to me.
It's like
and
you're weirdly leaned back.
Yeah. I hate it as a term. And I've had a few times where people come in who've read a whole bunch on it and they use the term in every sentence. Do you ever have that happen where you're just like, stop saying the word? Do you ever have that?
Only with you when you say capacity.
You know what the other one is for me? Capacity. Capacity is also one for you. Sorry.
You just say it far too often.
Butt cheek is the other one. I don't like that term.
Why'd you say it then?
I want you to understand those are two. I don't like butt wink. I don't like butt cheek. I think they sound bizarre.
So folks should not be doing butt cheek activation to help with their hip internal and external rotation.
We're going to talk about butt capacity today. I think if it leads with butt for some reason, my brain goes, I feel like we should use a different term.
Yeah.
So posterior tilt is what people are describing. So your pelvis posteriorly tilts. Basically what that does is it moves your hip out of the flexion and also gives you hip internal rotation. That's why you do it.
Is that good or bad?
Well, it's bad in the sense that when you posterior tilt your pelvis, you flex your spine. And so now you're in a lower position with increased lumbar flexion, which the more your spine flexes, the more you load the disc. And then the lever that's on your spine is also larger. So you have a much greater force on your lumbar spine.
And a higher risk of injury, I would assume.
I think it can overload it. Yeah.
You're in that position while trying to do a squatting motion.
Yeah. I mean, but and this is where we can kind of think through it. If you do it, what's the benefit versus the risk? So if there's a benefit that you can think of that's worth the risk of increased lumbar flexion, like if there's something for it, you can make a debate on it, but I don't see it.
Okay. One of the things that I hear a lot, and I don't know if you've diagnosed me with this before, but is hip impingement.
Mm-hmm.
Is hip impingement the thing contributing to that tightness feeling in the front while I'm squatting?
It depends on how you classify an impingement. So impingement for me is any time that you have a tissue being basically smashed between two different structures. Okay. You can have a femoral acetabular impingement, an FAI, that is very different than a tendon getting smashed between two bones. So an FAI, you can have, there's two main forms, and this is where there's actually a structural abnormality. You can have an acetabular impingement, and that's the socket that the femoral head goes into, and it can be basically almost like sharpened and deeper. It's way more common in women. And the edge will actually pinch down on tissue between from the acetabulum will actually pinch on tissue. So that's one. The other one is a cam impingement, which you actually see much more often in men, which is where the femoral neck gets bigger. And so it rams into the acetabular ridge, but it's doing it because the neck is actually larger.
Is that like the labrum? Like it's pinching the labrum? I feel like that's the one I most commonly hear about.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because it can be very extremely painful in those situations. And then that one is one of them where you have to let the area desensitize if you have any hope of rehabbing it, but it can be very, very hard to desensitize that area. The other way that you can think of it though is you can impinge tendons or get pressure on tendons that don't feel comfortable. And typically the way we diagnose that would be, say you flex the hip and then they start to feel pain in the front of the hip. You can test each of the muscles that flex the hip. So you have your TFL, sartorius, pectineus, rectus femoris, adductor longus, and adductor brevis. And all of those muscles flex your hip, and psoas, the iliopsoas as well. And so those can all be mashed a little bit when you produce flexion. And so then you can feel each of those tendons, the ones that are actually palpable. And you can compress those yourself. So you can do what's called the circumduction test, where I actually use the femur on the pelvis to basically apply compression to each of those tendons, and you can find which one's actually hurting the person. And then you can treat it that way, which is, in my opinion, that is a form of a hip impingement. It's just not the classical one that you'll typically read about in the research.
Thank you for the anatomy lesson.
Yes.
Is that kind of what your diagnosis process looks like if somebody comes in and says, I'm having pain in my hip when I squat?
Yeah. It's a piece of it. I mean, right? So like I talked about before, there's 4 pillars for our way that we think of it through diagnosis. We have the structural exam. What we're looking for, that if somebody's having pain with a squat, we want to see that they have how much hip flexion they have. For example, if they can't get past 90 and we have a hard stop, now we know what the diagnosis is, some way related to, you don't have hip flexion. So we have to, and that does happen. Other times it's that they're massively missing hip internal rotation. And then that may be because, they're trying to squat with their feet straight ahead, but they don't have any internal rotation. The treatment would be you teach them to externally rotate their feet when they squat. So we go through a structural diagnosis basically to figure out what structure is actually part of the pain generator. And then we go to a functional exam, which basically helps us understand how they're moving through the world and if their function is causing that anatomy to get overloaded. Then we do a treatment response, see what they have a good response to. And then finally, we really dive through their triggers. And based off all that, we get to a diagnosis. So if somebody comes in with a painful squat, you're really thinking hip flexion, make sure that they have enough range of motion for producing the squat to the depth they're going to. You want to know which tendons or what structure is actually getting hurt or painful from it. And then from there, how are they producing the motion? And most people, the way that they squat is a component of how they hurt themselves.
So that's kind of one of the first things you're going to do, is you're going to kind of look at their either individual anatomy or kind of the way that they're moving. And then based on that, you can kind of modify or look at the way that they stand when they squat, whether maybe they need to bring it in a little bit, or maybe they need to go wide, or maybe they need to face their toes out. You can kind of look at all of those things.
Yeah, and that'd be like the most basic way to look at it,
yeah.
Right? But then when you're producing motion, then you also have to think about every muscle in your hip has almost all of them have more than one action that they're doing. So for example, the TFL, the reason you turn it on at all is it's also a hip abductor. So if you're trying to use the TFL to keep your knees apart, for example, you're going to overfire because it's also a hip internal rotator. So we don't really want that muscle that on during a squat. And so if you feel it in the front, which I would say TFL is the most commonly overused muscle in the hip, you're not using your glute max well, which is a hip extensor, external rotator, and hip abductor. So then, like when you think about the squat pattern, you always have to think about what muscle produces which motion. So if you're not getting good external rotation as well, as you start to go down and their external rotators aren't working well enough, once again, you lose internal rotation, right? Because it's not keeping your hip externally rotated. So as you start to descend, you'll literally go into the motion that you don't have enough of, which then means you have to do a compensation. And so people will have these kind of interesting patterns develop because they're using the wrong muscle when they're doing the activity. And you know what I mean?
I've had to include foam rolling of both TFLs as well as glute activation pretty much before any leg day. And it took a little bit, but after kind of consistently hitting that, I want to say for 2 or 3 months, I think that's when most of my squatting hip pain started to go away. I know that seems very simple, but sometimes these things can be simple remedies, and sometimes it's going to be a little bit more complicated.
Well, it's a good point, though. I mean, because so if for you, though, you actually have fantastic hip mobility, if I remember correctly. I mean, you can get you've always been able to go really deep.
Yeah.
And so hip flexion's never been limited. But there has been a period of time where you've irritated stuff and you lost a little bit internal rotation of your hip.
Yeah.
Right. And so in that mode, if you think of it through that, that's the joint was irritable. And so we got the joint to become less irritable. And in the process, that allowed your hip to basically tolerate the hip internal rotation that's needed for a squat.
Yeah. And get the full range of motion.
Get the full range of motion. And so to me, for example, it's really common in men to not have adequate hip internal rotation, which means when you get into the squat, you have to pre-position your leg in more external rotation, right? So that's just like the out-toeing position,
yeah,
right? And if you don't do that, if you go narrow, or not narrow. If you go like feet straight ahead, that means you're locking in your internal rotation, and that means you have less relative internal rotation. The more externally rotated your feet are, the more internal rotation you're going to have available to your squat.
But I feel like the, cookie cutter, quote unquote, version of squat is taught to be with feet or toes facing forward.
I don't know where that came from.
Why does that seem to cause so many issues? Is it because just
the lack of internal rotation?
Yeah.
Right. So if people who have a lot of motion, they don't have an issue with it. It's the people who have if you're going to butt against any motion loss or just your normal hip anatomy, men are typically going to have greater external rotation than internal rotation. You have some people who come in who have aneurysm in their hip joint, which just means that they are more internally rotated. They have torsion in their femur or in their acetabulum that makes it so that they have a lot more internal rotation. Have you ever heard of a W sit?
W sit? No.
So it's where if you're sitting, your knees are ahead and your feet are on the outside, and you sit your butt down in between it. That's a W sit.
Knees are inside?
So the knees are inside, feet are on the outside, and they're like...
You're like banging your knees together?
Yeah, it's like subverse, like a crisscross where you're wrapped, like you're like the normal one that people typically sit.
Where would we use this?
Well, I'm just saying there's some people who can sit that way. That means you have massive hip internal rotation.
Okay.
Right? Like that's
in a squat position.
No, so you'll see sometimes how kids, have you ever seen a kid sit in W sit? We got to make sure we put a photo of this up.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Like
it's
small children will like sit like I know exactly what you're talking about.
And so I was reading, I don't even remember which ortho book this was in, I was looking over, but they had a photo of it and I was like, yeah, I'm going to try this right now. And it felt like somebody was ripping my body apart.
I think
like my knee and my hip. Yeah. See, that means you have a lot of internal rotation, right? Whereas people will sometimes come in and they're like, I can't sit with my legs crossed. There's something wrong with me. I'm so stiff. Well, and then I check their hip joint. It's like, no, you have a lot of hip internal rotation. You just have no external rotation. That's just not going to be the way you're going to sit. You literally have a joint limitation. We're not going to break your hip bone. Like we don't want
to be able to sit.
Yeah, you don't want to sit that way. We're not going to David Goggins stretch for 2 hours. Like that doesn't make sense.
Alrighty, we're not going to stretch for 2 hours.
No, and I also nothing against David Goggins. I don't want that guy on that guy's bad side.
After you,
my God,
what kind of hunting did you call it the other day?
Persistence hunting. Yeah, he would just run me to the ground.
He'd win.
He'd murder me in a lot of different ways. It'd be terrifying.
So say somebody is dealing with this right now. I luckily, knock on wood, am not dealing with this currently.
Yet.
If somebody's dealing with it, like what are you doing to attack it? I know I gave a couple of my little strategies there. For me, but
I mean, that's a good point though. It's what specifically is causing the squat to hurt. So if you're feeling more, it feels almost like a muscle builds and tightness. It's almost, I find it to be very, very common to be the TFL. The TFL, like I said, it's a hip flexor, hip internal rotator, and a hip abductor. You need to do activities that turn it down. My favorite one is like a bridge is an easy one, but you wouldn't believe how often I have people who try to do a bridge and they still bring their TFL on. So you have to do something that shuts off the hip flexors. So if you can't even do a bridge without feeling it in the front of your hip, which means like you go up and you still feel tightness in the front of your hip, then I would do a prone glute squeeze, which is literally... You go on your stomach.
Squeeze.
It's a butt squeeze. You're like
a butt cheek squeeze.
I hate you so much.
Specific. And if you can get up your butt cheek squeeze capacity, your front hip pain will all disappear.
Yeah. So you want to do it so that you really, really target the glute max the most. And so the easiest way, you go on your stomach. And you just try to squeeze your butt, which is basically using it as a hip extensor.
But nothing else.
That's
the hard part, is just squeezing either one or both cheeks.
Without feeling anything anywhere else. The other part that I'll sometimes do, depending on how hard it is for the person to feel it, then I'll also put a band around their knees, same position. So they'll abduct their knees. So it means basically pushing the band apart. And now squeeze your butt. And then the final one to see if I can get it to where they only feel it in their glutes would be on their stomach, squeeze their glutes, separate their knees, and then bring their heels together and pull and push, because then you're finding it as external rotators. And that typically gets the glute without turning on the TFL, and then hold that for time. And really what you're doing is you're building literally a connection to your brain with your glutes. and that's going to help to shut down the TFL.
Super awkward to do. I've done it not only for the TFL, but also for a hamstring issue where I was pushing my toes into an immovable object while not activating my hamstring, but also activating my butt cheek.
So that's a little bit different.
It's different, but it's like same concept.
It is. You're trying to get the muscle, and you're taking advantage of the muscle's antagonists, other muscles that would shut down that muscle at the same time. So the reason that one works really well, the one we just talked about for the glute max, is now we're getting after the hip flexor component, and if you squeeze your glutes as a hip extensor and the front of your hip fires, that means you have a co-contraction, which is very unhealthy for a joint, period, because that means you're getting contraction you shouldn't be happening. But then you throw on extra stuff like the external rotation at the same time. That's also something the TFL doesn't do. So those using multiple ways to get after shutting down the muscle that's overfiring can be very, very useful. So for the hamstring one, you were using the quad to shut off the hammy along with the glute.
Yeah. I just love how awkward it looked in the gym as I'm like aggressively touching my
Was your
glute
face strained?
My face is strained. I'm like touching my butt cheek to make sure that it's activated, and then touching my hamstring to make sure it's not activated. And I'm laying on my belly randomly with my foot against a pole in the gym.
You know, my favorite one is people will be in the gym and they'll be standing there with their eyes closed doing like a balance exercise, and they'll be like, they got lost again. They don't know where they're at. And they're like, it's like I say it every time, so it's definitely not funny anymore to them, but for some reason I always find it funny. So it's still funny.
That's, speaking of single leg balance, that's one that with the band around my legs and doing single leg balance, I do feel like I get some good hip activation out of that one. Another little tool just prior to getting to your squats that
works really well. So especially if you're feeling it in the front of the hip. So the easiest one, if you're feeling the front of the hip, is to fire extensors beforehand. That's if you have a muscle that's overactive like the TFL. If it's a tendon injury and you're feeling it with compression, then it's a little bit different. So in that situation, you don't want to go into compression. You don't want to go deep enough that you feel it there. And you want to do something to basically increase tendon health. My concern is that sometimes loading that tendon, so if you do some type of resistance to it to help load it, what I find that can often blow up in your face because you actually didn't start to overfire that muscle in an activity that it shouldn't hurt with. So that's not my favorite way to go after it. I like to do tissue work to the tendon and then really focus on reducing the overload that's happening to the tendon instead of doing the eccentric loading or the tendon loading that's supposed to be so healing.
Yeah. I think traction is probably another easy one if you're having those compressive forces.
Yeah.
Tractioning the hips, and you can do that band assisted or from a qualified physical therapist like Craig.
Dude, but that's like, so if you all of a sudden are losing motion though, so if you find that your motion loss is happening on one side versus the other, feels dramatically more stiff, that can really point to it being a joint. And that's where I think getting somebody involved sooner on that one would make a ton of sense, because there's lots of ways that you can traction it. But once again, like we talked about in the last episode, if you're starting to go down the route of like an OA or an osteoarthritic hip, that can present in the front of the hip the way we're describing. And oftentimes it's because you're losing motion. And so if you start to go down and all of a sudden it hurts, there's all sorts of ways for us to take off that compressive load. But if you keep on just doing it and bashing it, it's going to obviously feel worse.
Yeah, I had a little bit of that because I was doing the leg extension machine quite a bit and pushing that one, but through, testing and just trying to figure things out, I found that the leg extension was making my hips a little bit angry. So I've kind of
interesting.
Yeah,
like
I
what
think
way?
We talked about that.
I don't remember.
Ago. I think it was just contributing to my TFL.
Oh yeah, overload.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. It's like, why would your TFL has nothing to do with that. So I wonder what about it?
Just getting more turned on during those ones. And so I've switched to just primarily doing isometrics there for my knee. But I think there can be other factors in terms of maybe your lifts or your daily activity that can be contributing to.
Makes it more predisposed for it to fire.
It's kind of an obvious hidden trigger that I had to pull apart and find it. But once I found it, it made a lot of sense.
So I find that interesting. So you also want to look at if there's preceding exercises or exercises that you're doing that are turning it on too much.
Right.
So if that happens,
that was one of them.
Yeah, you want to remove it. You want to remove that activity or modify it so that's not causing it.
Which is what you build your tissue capacity, and then once it's back up and running, then you can jump back into it. It's not like you've got to cut things out of your workout forever, but you want to cut out those triggers while you're building your therapeutic cap to hopefully get yourself feeling a little bit better.
Well, one of the things I think about too with the squat, right, is we've talked about the term active insufficiency, right? That's when you take and you shorten a muscle and then ask it to fire. And so if you're starting to get muscles that are firing when they shouldn't, like in the squat, and say your hip flexors are firing, they're in the worst position to fire, which is going to be, it's basically going to take and make it so that you're teaching your hips to cramp, basically. Every time you go down that far deep squat, you shorten the muscle as much as you can. And then if you have like a weird overactivation of a muscle that shouldn't be there, it'll turn on, but it's turning on at the worst place ever. So you're basically teaching yourself to cramp, which is not ideal, to say the least. Yeah.
I don't think anybody likes cramping.
Danny? No, Danny doesn't either.
Yeah, nobody likes cramping. Nope. It's not a good feeling at all.
I have induced cramping in people before, and it's glorious. You know, like where somebody's like, I don't think that's my pain. I'm like, well, let's put it in this position. The foot one is like my favorite. Somebody has heel pain and they don't think it's muscle. And
I
they
had mine in a hamstring, and it was like, whoa,
yeah.
Why'd you do that?
Well, it's a game changer. It's a game changer. It's like the moment before you had that happen, and there's a moment after, right? There's life before that cramp, and then the life after, and it's never the same. It's eye-opening.
Aside from aggressively stretching the hip, what other fixes?
Well, you're talking about aggressively stretching the hip.
Well, that's obviously the best treatment for any sort of hip flexion problems that you have.
Okay.
Right?
No.
Oh, I must have been
That's
mistaken.
So tough. So, yeah, I think the most common one that I see people get prescribed or that will be offered as a remedy for hip mobility, which is kind of interesting. They'll be given the couch stretch.
Yeah.
You've seen that, right?
Yep.
And not just a couch stretch. They'll be shown this aggressive against the wall, stretch it till you feel something pop in the front of your hip stretch. And I think that's
your hip loosening up.
It's your hip. Yeah. It's you destroying your hip. That doesn't make sense. Like it just doesn't. It's the length is not an issue for your hip flexors. If you're literally making hip flexion less, right? So I mean, like if you're reducing the length of the muscle, it makes no sense to think you need to increase the length of that muscle. That's just nonsense. And so I think that's just important to remember that stretching is stupid in this situation if you're having this type of symptom. That's all.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that was clear.
I think aside from that, just trying to get into pain-free ranges of motion.
Oh, yeah. So, you asked what are the things you could do besides that. Yeah, I lost it.
That's all right.
I think the biggest thing too, so make sure you have adequate motion and that your foot set up as well, right? So
it could be going to a box squat or setting your depth at a certain level so that it doesn't get into a painful spot. And obviously you want to try and progress that to get into better and fuller ranges of motion. The band around the knees, is that one that typically can help with that one?
Well, it helps a lot because if you're pushing out with your knees,
what it is,
it externally rotates and abducts your hip, which will help to target your glute max over any other muscle. Glute max is critical for squats, and so that's why it's like it's almost a get out of jail free card. It helps so much with symptoms. So if you're going to go home and you want to squat, my first thing I would do is that if you notice that as you start to go down, you immediately round your back, try stepping a little bit farther apart with your feet and then rotate your feet out more. And you might get to where it's pretty far out before you find the right spot. Because what we want to basically get you about 45 degrees of relative hip internal rotation. And if you get to that point, you're going to be able to squat well. After that, you can use tools to basically target the muscle you want to fire the whole time. And the most important muscle in this situation is going to be your glute max and your quad. The quad's going to get loaded a ton, but as you get to keep the glute max on, what I find it does is it keeps you from internally rotating and losing the motion that you just got from your foot positioning.
I'm going to have to try that this week. I feel like I'm a toes straight type of squatter, but I don't really ever think about it because I'm not having any problems.
Yeah, I wouldn't change it. Yeah, I don't think I think it's only if you're finding that you don't round your back. Yeah, it feels like you get stuck. It's just to remember that hip flexion, when you flex your hip in the sagittal plane, which is just this plane, you're not just going to hip flexion, you're also using hip rotation because your hip joint's not perfectly in one plane.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All righty. Well, hopefully those strategies can help some of our listeners out there get into a little bit deeper of a squat and hopefully in a pain-free range.
Have fun with it. Go squat.
Go squat. Yeah, this is your cue. Stop the podcast and go squat right now.
Go squat.
Alrighty. We'll see you on the next one.
If you are enjoying this podcast and finding the information useful, please consider supporting us by following the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.
By subscribing, you help ensure we can continue bringing you this high-level training and rehab science every single week. Leaving us a 5-star review on those platforms is also one of the absolute best, zero-cost ways to support our mission and help grow this community. Our podcast is proudly sponsored and brought to you by Smith Performance Center. If you are an active adult looking to bridge the gap between rehab and elite performance, or if you want to optimize your health from every angle, go to smithperformancecenter.com. They offer elite physical therapy, strength and sports training, and dedicated nutrition coaching to help you build a resilient body that handles the activities you love without breaking down.
If you want to connect with us, see our training clips, or watch the full video versions of these episodes, follow us on Instagram at Spiker Keicher, Craig Smith PT, and Past Your Prime Podcast. And subscribe to the Past Your Prime Podcast on YouTube.
Thanks for tuning in, and remember, you're not past your prime, you're just getting started.
PYP, baby.
Peace. Second place is the first loser. Sounds even worse.
It does, actually. Jesus.